Wow, good morning. I may have caught you by surprise. Let me try that one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
I really appreciate Paul's great job of leading us as we have been singing together and joining our voices, and I also appreciate his very kind and generous introduction. I'm telling you, there is no place that I'd rather be than at Clear Creek, unless it's Brentwood Hills. But when Jake called and asked if I'd be here this Sunday morning, I didn't have to look at my calendar. It didn't matter what was on my calendar. I said, of course I can be there. And it's not just because my oldest daughter's here. My oldest daughter has two daughters. They happen to be our granddaughters. I'll go anywhere that they are. In fact, to paraphrase a familiar phrase, it's like I heard a friend say, and this will be true, I go to Clear Creek at the drop of a hat, and I'll drop the hat. So it's just delightful to be here. Carol and I are delighted to. Jake was so gracious in dealing with all the details. He contacted me. He said, "Do you need a place to stay?" I said, "I better not." And so I am thankful that we can be here with Amy and Tom and Caroline and Charlotte and with all of you. I could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of people in this audience that are special and mean so much to us. Joey is a dear friend and encouraging preacher friend of mine, and we've known each other for years, way back when he was in Nashville and I was at Antioch, and I'm thankful that he's away so I can be here today. And I appreciate very much the privilege and the opportunity. Let me tell you who really this morning's message is directed towards. Because this may not relate to you, but it's directed towards anybody that is just not as excited about your life as you'd like to be, or as excited about your job as you'd like to be, or as excited about your responsibilities in life as you'd like to be. I mean, you may be in education, you may be a school teacher, you may be a coach, you may be an administrator, you may be in business, you may be a business owner, you may be a supervisor, you may be climbing the ladder, you may be a new employee, you may be working in the lowest levels of that particular business. You may be unemployed, you may be retired, you may be a student. And we could continue with all kinds of examples, and we could fit in whatever it is that applies to you, but you're saying, you know what, I used to be excited about my job, I used to be excited about whatever it is. Maybe your role as a parent or a grandparent. And you say, you know, I think it's I know what I'm doing is important, but I've just kind of lost my zip. What's wrong with me? Can it possibly change? Is there anything that I can do? Now, I don't stand before you claiming to have all the answers or perhaps even any of the answers. What I want to do, though, is share with you, and I'll just tell you where we're headed. I'm going to share with you one verse of Scripture, 4 stories, four quick stories, and one question. One verse of Scripture, 4 stories. 2 of the stories are parables, which is a story that has a powerful message or an important message, but it's not necessarily a true story in every aspect. The other 2 stories are absolutely true. But all of these relate to a verse out of Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We're studying Ecclesiastes this summer at Brentwood Hills, and when we came to the 9th chapter, and this first part of verse 10 just kind of jumped off the page. It was one of the passages in Ecclesiastes. To everything there's a season is another one of them. This is one of the verses in Ecclesiastes I was already familiar with. I wasn't exactly sure where it was. I'd never preached on it. But read it with me. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Now read it with your might. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Now it goes on to say, if you look that verse up, he says, because there's going to come a time you're going to be in the world of the dead, you're not going to be able to do anything. In other words, time is short. Kind of like the song we used to sing, we still sing it, I'm sure. We haven't sung it this morning, and I haven't sung it in a long time, but work for the night is coming. When man works is done, or when man works no more. And he says, whatever your hand finds to do, you don't have forever. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Story number one, Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot may be a name you're familiar with, maybe not. Jim Elliot was born a few months after my father was born. My father went to heaven about 11 years ago. Jim Elliot was born and was up in Oregon and was raised up in that part of the country and then went to school at Wheaton outside of Chicago. And he had a real desire to serve Jesus Christ in every aspect of his life, and he had a real passion for the mission field. His family wanted him to go into the youth ministry and wanted him to stay closer to home, but he wanted to go into other parts of the world. And he had his eyes set on either India or Ecuador. He ended up going to Ecuador. When he was about a junior at Wheaton, he met a young lady named Elizabeth Howard. And they really had good chemistry. They became very close, and they had a similar love for the Lord, but he knew that before he could commit himself to anyone, he had to really seek that fulfillment of that vision to serve the Lord in places where God had never been taught, where Jesus Christ had never been communicated. And he went to Ecuador. He moved first to Quito in 1952, and he had another man from Wheaton who went with him. He went in 1952 and worked in Quito for a while as they became familiar with the area, and then in 1953, Elizabeth came and they were married with only one other couple there as witnesses. They were married in Quito, but they lived in the jungle where they had established a camp because they wanted to be close to these indigenous people who had never been reached with the gospel. He had studied languages at Wheaton so he could translate the scriptures into the native language. Once he learned and understood the native language, he had been trained by the Wycliffe Bible translator people. There he was in 1953, a newlywed, living in the jungle there in Ecuador, trying to build relationships with these people who had never had relationships with anybody from the outside. In 1955, they had a daughter, their only child, because in 1956, Jim Elliot and 4 of his missionary colleagues were working with the Auca Indian, the Aucas in Ecuador. Auca was their word that we would translate savage. They had thought they had developed a relationship with them, but it turned out that one of the people that they had nicknamed George because they couldn't easily pronounce his normal name, they called him George. They thought that George was somebody they could trust. They even took him on a flight on their little plane that Nate Saint flew. But George reported back to the headquarters of their tribe that these people were up to no good. He lied about them. He misrepresented their motives. And even though they felt like they were making progress, 10 of those Aucas came and martyred 5 missionaries. Jim Elliot, one of them, Nate Saint, another. Elizabeth Elliot has written 2 books about him, one through In the Shadow of the Almighty, the story of his life, and the other Through Gates of Splendor, the story of his martyring. Nate Saint, the pilot, who was also martyred in that group that was slaughtered right there by the river, and their bodies were then thrown in the river and later captured downstream, recovered downstream. Nate Saint's story is told in a movie called The End of the Spear. But they found his journal. And in Jim Elliot's journal, he would write his daily prayers and his daily thoughts. And probably one of the best known quotes of Jim Elliot is a quote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Now, some have studied this and say, well, he was just quoting one of the older preachers from centuries earlier, and maybe so. He wasn't writing this for publication. He was writing this as his daily prayer journal. But he wrote, he is no fool who gives what he can't keep to gain what he can't lose. And maybe you've read that quote. Maybe you've heard that quote. Jim Elliot is where it really became well known. But the reason I mentioned Jim Elliot this morning is not because of this quote, it's because of another quote. In that same journal, Jim Elliot wrote, "Wherever you are, be all there." How many of us this morning need to hear that? You may not even be here this morning. Your mind is at work already tomorrow, what you've got to do. You're planning what you're going to do this afternoon. You're thinking about what you should have done yesterday. You're not here. Wherever you are, be all there. Live to the hilt every situation you believe to be the will of God. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Story number 2 involves a book that was written called The Precious Present. Spencer Johnson. Spencer Johnson is the best-selling author. He's a medical doctor by training and by profession, but he's also an author that's become a true bestseller years ago. He wrote The 1-Minute Manager. He wrote Who Moved My Cheese, or 2 of his better-known books, but he's written a bunch of them. But he wrote a motivational book called The Precious Present. It's a book you may have read. It's a book you may have a copy of. It's a book that's easy to order and easy to find. It's a book that's illustrated, but you can also, if all you want is the text of the book, if all you want is the story, that's easy to find even on the internet without paying anything. It takes you about 1.5, maybe half a minute to find it. And I'm not going to try to tell you the whole story, but I'm going to give you just a glimpse. The story begins. Once there was a boy who listened to an old man, and thus he began to learn about the precious present. The old man told him. He said, it's a present because it's a gift. And it's precious because whoever receives this gift will be happy forever. Well, when this boy heard this man tell him about this precious present, he was fascinated. He said, wow, I want to get that present for Christmas. And about that time, his attention span changed and he ran off to play. He spotted a swing in the distance, and this older man just loved watching this boy play. He would just smile. This boy had such a zest for life. He watched this boy run across the yard and hop onto this swing and swing his heart out, and he was laughing the whole time and singing. The old man also liked to watch this boy work. They lived in the same neighborhood, and he would sometimes, early in the morning, he would see this boy out cutting a neighbor's yard. And when he cut the yard, he would cut with a smile on his face, and he would either be singing or whistling even while he was cutting the yard. He had such a great zeal and excitement for life. But the boy was thinking about what the man had told him. The precious present. The precious present. Whoever has it is going to be happy forever. Well, he knew about presents. He had received a bicycle for his birthday. He received gifts under the tree at Christmas time. He knew that presents were exciting, but he also knew that presents, their lifespan is kind of limited. You can be really excited for a while about a bicycle. You can be really excited for a while about other things, but after a while, the newness kind of wears off and they're not nearly as exciting. They don't make you nearly as happy. You're always kind of looking for something else. He went back to the man. He said, I've got a question for you. He said, this precious present, I haven't figured out exactly what it is yet. He said, let me ask you a question. Is it a magic ring that you can put on your finger and then get whatever it is that you wish for? And the man said, oh no. It's not a ring and it has nothing to do with wishes. He said, well, is it a magic carpet? That you can sit on this magic carpet and then the magic carpet will take you to wherever it is that you want to go. He said, oh no, you don't understand. The precious present has nothing to do with where you are. It does not depend upon your location. It's not something that you wish for. It's not something that depends upon your surroundings. And so now he's really confused. And so he searches the world. He reads everything that he can read. He talks to everybody that he can talk to, and he can't figure out what the precious present is. Then he goes back to see this older friend, and he says, I'm a little bit frustrated. He said, nobody's given me this precious present. He says, now I'm no longer a child. Now I'm a young man, and nobody gave me this present. You say, once I get it, I'll be happy forever. He says, I just can't figure it out. And he says, oh, let me tell you something, son. He said, you have known what it is. In fact, you have experienced it. You know how it works. He said, you had it when you were a child, but you've simply forgotten. And he said, well, who's going to give it to me? And he said, nobody is going to give it to you. He says the precious present is not something that somebody else gives to you. It's something that you give to yourself. And that confused him even more. Well, you read the story as it goes on, and a number of different things happen, and finally he gets to the point where the older man can no longer communicate with him. He's unable to talk. The younger man is so frustrated at this point because he thinks, I will never know. I will never know about the precious present. And he remembered, he says, it's not something you can wish for, and it's not something that depends on where you are, and it's something that you give yourself. And then it finally dawned on him. The precious present is exactly that. It's the present. It's where you are right now. It's learning to maximize the very experience that is before you, whatever your hand finds to do. He says you can't live in the past and you can't live in the future. You can't be paralyzed by the past. You can't long for the past. You can't regret the past. And you can't just spend all of your time thinking, well, one of these days, one of these days, one of these days. He says you've got to live right here and now. That's what he had done as a child. That's what he had done as a young boy. And his friend had explained to him in ways that he finally had to figure out for himself that the real priceless gift of life is to learn to live not in the past, not in the future, but right now. The precious present. The third story is a parable. It's a parable you may be very familiar with because it comes from Matthew chapter 25. Now, Matthew 25 tells us the story of the 10 virgins. It also tells us the story where God gathers everybody before the throne and separates the sheep from the goats. And that's the story, the very familiar story where he says, I was hungry and thirsty and naked and a stranger, and you took care of me. And they said, when did we do that? Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. But also in that same chapter, we read what we often refer to as the parable of the talents. In the more recent version of the New International Version, it's called the story of the bags of gold. Because the master had given some very valuable things to his 3 servants. He had given 5 bags of gold or 5 talents to one of his servants, 2 bags or 2 talents to another, and 1 talent or 1 bag of gold to a third. And then the master goes away, to return to find that the one with 5 talents had taken his and had maximized them, had invested them, had used them, and had doubled what he had. He was thrilled with that. The man with 2 talents had done the same thing. He had taken his 2 talents, invested them, and he now had 4 talents instead of just 2. The master was thrilled with that. But then along comes the man who had 1 talent. And he had all kinds of excuses, but to cut it to the chase, he had buried his talent. He had sat on it. He had done nothing with it. He had wasted the moment. And as a result, he hadn't lost it, but he hadn't gained anything either, and the master wasn't pleased with that at all. In fact, he took that away from him, gave it to the one who had 10, and sent this man to punishment. But the reason I tell this story, because there are a lot of different directions you could go with this very familiar parable, but I want to zero in on one sentence that the master spoke to both of the first two faithful servants. When he talked to the man who had 5 and multiplied to 10, when he talked to the man who had 2 and multiplied to 4, he said word for word, identically the same thing. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Read that out loud with me. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. One more time. You have been faithful. I will put. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Wherever you are, be all there. The precious present. Whoever is faithful with a few, I will put him in charge of many. All right, we've heard one true story, Jim Elliott, 2 parables, one more true story. How many of you have ever heard of Duck Dynasty? Raise your hand. Anybody? Okay. I'm curious about those of you who haven't. That's what I'm really curious about. But Duck Dynasty is a phenomenon. I know it was a couple of years ago that they were here for, I think, spoke here in Chattanooga at Boyd Buchanan, and they've been at Lipscomb, largest crowd in the history of Lipscomb University. Filled up Allen Arena 3 times. Unheard of. There was concern when they were first booked. I probably shouldn't say this. There was concern when they were first booked. How are we going to fill it up once? There was nothing to worry about. We sold it out 3 times, over 16,000 people on a Friday and a Saturday. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What's happened with them? It breaks all the molds. I mean, when that magazine article came out, and then all of a sudden A&E says, we're taking Phil Robertson off the show. Cracker Barrel was one of those. It said, we're taking all the Duck Dynasty stuff out of our restaurant. Nobody was too terribly shocked about that because Phil Robertson had had the nerve to say something politically incorrect in a public magazine, and so that's just the way the world reacts. But then not too long after that, A&E does an about-face, Cracker Barrel does an about-face, and you think, wow, there is something going on here. Something going on here. There was in USA Today in the last 2 weeks, they were talking about cable television and talking about, talking about the cable television shows. And they just happened to mention that Duck Dynasty has had as many as 11 million plus people watch at any given time. That's not over a cumulative period. That's on one particular night. That many people are watching from their homes, which is historic. Historic. You don't need me to tell you that. I was in a Walmart right here in Chattanooga just within the last 24 hours. They've got a whole section of Duck Dynasty stuff. Explain that to me. All right. Now, what I'm about to tell you is unauthorized, okay? But I think I might have a good idea on why this is happening. And what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. About 6 years ago, I guess, 2008, how many years ago would that be? 6 years? 2008? 6 years ago this fall, at the Brentwood Hills Church of Christ. There are a group of guys there, and Jason, were you still there 6 years ago? You were already gone? You'd have been there if you were there, but there were a group of guys there that have a men's ministry, a back 40 ministry is what they call it, and these are guys who are big-time hunters. And they have a wild game dinner. Y'all might have one here, wild game dinner. And I'm a wuss. And I don't hunt, I don't fish, and I don't usually eat from those who do. And so, I mean, I'm just a wuss, okay? That's just not my thing, never has been. But we're having this wild game dinner at Brentwood Hills on a Saturday night, and I need to be there. Why? Because I was the preacher. And the preacher they're supposed to go to things like that. I'm going to make the closing announcements. I'm going to welcome all of our guests. And I'm thrilled by it. They have great program and great fellowship. But this night they're having this guy. They say, who's the speaker? He's the duck commander. I said, the who? The duck commander. What's his name? Phil Robertson. I'd never heard of him. Never heard of him. He's got this little show on cable television on how to go duck hunting. I said, really? Didn't interest me in the slightest. I don't order duck if I go to a restaurant that has it. I mean, it's just not something I have any interest in. Never been duck hunting. But I know a lot of people who do. But they were all excited about it. I wasn't all that excited about it. But I was going to be there. So I go, and so I wouldn't have recognized him at all. And I look across and I said, who is that guy over there? He said, that's our speaker. Him? He's our speaker. And and Phil Robertson, he predated his sons. I mean, he had the full deal. His sons were there, but they were still clean shaven. And I said, he's really the speaker tonight? Yeah, he is. I said, okay, good. I trusted these guys. So we go through the meal and go through the preliminaries, and we're in there in the auditorium, and then I look around. So we've got this very larger than usual crowd. It wasn't packed, not current standards as far as audience, but I mean we had 500-600 people there. Mostly men, not all men, but mostly men. So I'm speaking to some people, and I speak to this, and this is when I realized something really is going on here. When I speak to these people right behind me, I said, hey, where are you from? Well, we're from Mississippi. I said, good, what brings you to town? This brought you to town? I said, yeah, we're here to hear the duck commander. Well, when did you come up? This morning. When are you going back tonight? Mississippi. I said, what's going on here? I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. And so he gets up there to speak. And for all I knew, he could have been speaking in a foreign language. Because he started saying, early in the morning, sun's getting ready to come up, and you see this blue-tailed, yellow, and I think, what is he talking about? And you could have heard a feather hit the floor. Because everybody's writing down every word he said. He's talking about a duck flying in at daybreak, or whenever they fly in. Flying out, I don't know. But he said, here's what you do. If you see that kind of a duck, here's what you do. And he did this thing, and they're all taking notes. And I'm thinking, I don't have a clue what he's talking about. So we sat there and listened. Here's where it got real interesting. Then he said, a lot of people ask me if they could go duck hunting with me. Because by now by then, 6 years ago, he had become a very well-known duck hunter, had his own cable television show. Nothing like today, but still. He said, people ask if they can go duck hunting with me. And he says, if I can take them, I always take them. Because he said, I found that when you get out with a guy, whether you know him well or not, you get out with a guy in a duck blind, you got a lot of time to talk. And he said, I want to tell you, listen to this. I want to tell you what I tell everybody that goes duck hunting with me, especially if they've never been before. And then he tells us what he tells them. Well, the next morning, I'm standing in the same place he was standing, in the pulpit area of the Brentwood Hills Church of Christ. Now, it really wasn't a pulpit area because it was still a duck blind. It had been set up the night before, and all behind us was a duck blind, but I thought I'd put on the waders and wear them in, but I didn't. They were still back in the baptistry, but I could have put those on and felt like maybe more dressed for the occasion, but I was totally serious about what I was about to say. I said, I just want to tell you something. When I came here last night, I didn't have any idea who Phil Robertson was. And I'm not a duck hunter, and all of you know that. And when he's talking about duck hunting, it didn't make any sense to me. That doesn't surprise any of you. But when he started talking about what he told those people that he'd go duck hunting with in the duck blind, when he told us that, he told the clearest, most convicting, the most compelling, the most powerful story of the gospel of Jesus Christ that has ever been told from this pulpit. And I'm totally convinced of that. I said, I have never told the gospel story as clearly as he told it last night. And so over the last 6 years, I've kind of watched, as the world has watched, this amazing phenomenon called Duck Dynasty. And I realized that here is a guy who was faithful when he had one person in the duck blind. One. What did Jesus say? If you're faithful with a few. And he was faithful after faithful after faithful after faithful after faithful. When he was unknown, when he wasn't making any money doing it, when he was just getting started and people would want to go duck hunting, he'd say, you know, I have a captive audience there in that duck blind, and here's what I tell them. He talked about baptizing people right there. And you know what God's done? This is what I believe. God's, he said, hey, Phil, you've been faithful over a few. I'm going to give you an opportunity to influence many. You know, that 11 million plus, that doesn't count the Walmarts and the grocery stores and, that number may be 4 times that large, maybe more than that. Because guess what? Whatever your hand finds to do, don't say, you know what? I'll get serious about sharing the gospel when I can have a group I can talk to. He had one person. But he did it, and he did it well, and he was talking about it 8 years ago, but before he was extremely well known, or 6 years ago, however long ago it was, before he was well known. But God has a way, when he says, if you're faithful over a few, I'll give you influence over much. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. So I ask you this question: who will be in your duck blind? You see, you go to work every day. You call it a duck blind if you want to. What I mean is, who is it that God gives you the influence over? Who is it? And you say, well, I'm stuck at home. I'm this, I'm that. I'm a caregiver. I'm raising kids. I'm responsible for this. I'm responsible for that. And see, a lot of times we don't look at the opportunities that we have, and that doesn't mean we do it exactly the way Phil Robertson does it. What we do is we pray for God's wisdom. God, how do you want me to be the father that you call me to be the grandfather that you've called me to be the boss in this particular small business that you've called me to be, the coach that you've called me to be, the salesman that you've called me to be? How do you want me to use the opportunities you've given me in this duck blind that may be called a cubicle, in a job that I'm so undervalued, where I'm so underpaid, where I'm so overqualified, but I'm in this duck blind called a cubicle? Maybe you want me to use my opportunities right here instead of fussing about what I don't have or fussing about what people don't recognize. Instead, God, maybe you want me to use what I've been given right now. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. God wants to use every one of us. It may be that even this morning, as we sing this invitation song, the Lord is calling you maybe to confess your faith in Christ and be baptized into Christ. Maybe He's calling you to rededicate your life. Maybe He's calling you to just share with others a prayer request. Whatever the need is, He's able to meet it, and He invites you to Him.